Hey guys, we're back for another episode of the Life of Jesus. Today, our focus is going to be on Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27. And this section of scripture raises lots of questions for me, and there are two different approaches that we could take. So let's just jump right in and see if we can paint a picture of this scene. Matthew 17:24. When they had came to Capernaum, that is Jesus and his disciples, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Now, the first question is, what's 2 drachma? Well, a drachma is an ancient Greek silver coin, and so we're really just talking about a monetary unit. And 2 drachma here is a reference to how much the temple tax was, and there were actually coins that were worth 2 drachma. But did you know that there was an official temple currency? That's right. It was believed that the Tyrian shekel was the only coin that a Jew could give in the temple treasury. Now, I have to admit that there's some debate over which coin was the official temple coin, what was on the coin, and where it was actually minted. Obviously, a lot of things that a lot of people weren't really that interested in. However, it's a really fascinating history and adds to the drama that's going on in this context. Now, this was a tax that every Jewish male was expected to pay for temple maintenance, and it had its origins deep in Jewish history. We can go all the way back to the time just after the Exodus from Egypt. In Exodus 30, 11, and 16, we have this census that was taken, and all the males 20 years and older were to give a half shekel of silver to support the tabernacle. And when the temple was built, this practice seemed to remain in place, with money collected from the census used to maintain the temple. 2 Kings 12, 4, and 5, good example of this. And then you have Jerusalem, which was destroyed, and with it the temple by the Babylonians. However, once they were allowed to return and rebuild, according to Nehemiah 10:32, the people placed upon themselves the obligation to contribute yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the temple. Now, I believe this practice probably continued from there and eventually evolved into the half shekel tax we see around the end of the Maccabean period into the time of Jesus. Now, it's important to note that during the time of Jesus, while they were expected to pay the tax, it was not enforced with legal penalties if you did not pay it. However, like many things that aren't necessarily enforced, the obligation you feel is enforcement enough. Now, just think back to the times when you might not have wanted to do something, but you did because you felt obligated or because you didn't want people to think you certain things about you. Now, if you've lived long enough, you might be able to think back to times when people questioned your faithfulness for not attending a worship service, or maybe you questioned other people's faithfulness for the same reason. See, I think we can understand the pressure that might have been felt to pay this tax, even though it wasn't technically required. And the temple was quite successful at collecting this tax as well. Obviously, it would be convenient to pay the temple tax when one journeyed to Jerusalem for Passover or for the other feasts. Remember, Jews came from everywhere, and if they wanted to be seen as dedicated and loyal to the temple and its priesthood, they would pay the tax. And this is where the money changes would come into play. Since there was just one kind of coin accepted, you would need to exchange whatever common currency you had from wherever you came from. Not just to pay the tax, but to also be able to do business while in Jerusalem, because who knew who would accept what? And the money changers, they were like the ATMs of their day. With exchange fees like ATM fees, it was a profitable business. Furthermore, before the war with the Romans that destroyed the temple and Jerusalem, the funds raised by this tax was so enormous that not only did they have plenty for the temple maintenance, but they had enough to get creative and add to its decor. And all that being said, there was some controversy around having this tax. Not everyone approved. Some disapproved on moral, ethical grounds, while others just didn't want to pay it and tried to figure out ways to get around it. And it's not always clear what side people fell on, but groups like the Sadducees and the Essenes and others, they actually disapproved of the tax. However, overall, it seems most probably paid their share of the tax, and in doing so, it demonstrated the fact that they were loyal Jews, dedicated to the temple and its priests. But let's not forget the temple aristocracy that had developed by the time of Jesus. More on that later. Now, What I find interesting with this context is that they go to Peter and they ask Peter this question. Why do they come to Peter? Why is he always first in the mix? Like in Matthew's account specifically, Peter is the first disciple to be called by Jesus. When Matthew gives us a list of the 12 apostles, Peter is the first name on the list. It is Peter who tries to be like Jesus and walk on water. Who confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God? Peter. It's Peter who Jesus points to as being one who has the keys of the kingdom, which we know to be a reference to the Gentiles entering into the kingdom of God. Peter witnesses the transfiguration. He is often a spokesperson for the disciples and seems to have the most questions. Matthew 15:15, Peter says, explain the parable to us. We don't understand it. Matthew 18:21, how often are we to forgive? Matthew 19:27, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? And it's Peter who pulls Jesus aside to rebuke him. And he is the most prominent in the events even leading up to Jesus' death in Matthew 26. Why is Peter so prominent? I think it was because he was the oldest of the disciples. And as the oldest, he would have naturally been seen as a leader. Now, that's just speculation. However, as you will see, he was at least 20 years old because he pays the temple tax. And I find it interesting that the temple tax is only paid for Jesus and Peter and none of the other guys. Coincidence? Maybe. Or does that indicate Peter's age in relation to the age of the other disciples? We can only speculate. Nonetheless, they come to Peter and they ask him the question. Matthew 17:25. Peter's response? Yes, yes, of course, my rabbi pays the temple tax. Now the question is, did Peter misspeak? Did he say yes without thinking? And by saying yes, did Peter give his word that Jesus would pay? Well, let's look at the rest of the verse. Look what happens. And when he, that is Peter, came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. It seems that Matthew's wanting to point out the fact that Peter was intending on bringing it up to Jesus, but Jesus said something first. And this is what he said. What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? Now, some translate others as strangers. And it's a word that deals with those who are not of one's own family. And so you have family and then you have everyone else. And in the context of a king, we're talking about the people or the subjects. So did Jesus bring this up to Peter because he spoke out of turn when he asked about the temple tax? Was it because Jesus never had intentions on paying the tax? Is this why Jesus brings it up to Peter? Let's examine what Jesus says here, and maybe we can make some sense of it all. We are talking about taxes imposed on the values of goods and property, and taxes imposed on people, which come from census. So Jesus essentially asks, do kings require their children to pay the taxes imposed on the population? Does the king tax his children or his people, his subjects? Their answer is, of course, the children don't pay taxes. They collect the tribute from the people. It's how they acquire their wealth. It's where their power comes from. It's how they're able to keep control of the resources people need to survive. It's how they are able to reorder the world to best suit them. And Peter knows how empire works. The king doesn't tax his children. He's trying to set them up for success, to establish themselves as potential rulers so the family can maintain their control for generations to come. So Peter understands. And Matthew 17:26 says this. And when he said this, that is from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free or exempt. The Greek word translated free here has to do with one who is not a slave or a subject, one who is exempt, not bound by obligation. And based on Jesus' response, it would be easy to quickly conclude that Jesus is just simply referencing the fact that he is the Son of God and the temple is his Father's house. Therefore, he would have no need to pay the tax. And then it's interesting that it is with Peter that he is having this conversation with, especially since it was Peter who confessed him to be the Son of God. This could be something that would reinforce that reality for him. If Jesus is who he is, then the principle would fit. Oh, that makes sense. And quite honestly, this is where many commentators stop. However, I think that there is more going on here. When you look at the controversy behind the temple tax, the message Jesus is starting to share with his disciples about what the religious leaders are going to do to him, I think there's another layer to what's going on here. And I think Jesus is not just simply talking about himself, but about Peter, the disciples, and even fellow Jews. Let's look at what Jesus does here. Matthew 17:27. However, Jesus goes on to say, not to give offense. The word offense here is not just simply the idea of tripping someone or causing someone to stumble. When we do that, right, they're able to get back up, or we're able to get back up. But this is the idea of trapping someone. And when you trap someone, they're stuck. They're not getting back up. And usually a trap means it's the end for them. Keep that in mind. Jesus says to not give offense to them, that is, the tax collectors, right? And maybe even other people. Jesus tells Peter to go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. Now, if you believe Peter just simply misspoke when he said Jesus would pay the temple tax, then maybe Jesus just simply paid it to keep Peter from breaking his word out of obligation, right? However, I got more questions. Why not just pay the tax from the money back? We know they had money. Jesus had people who helped him financially. Peter had a fishing business. We presume it was still operational. He had partners. He was a successful fisherman. He had a wife and a mother-in-law and possibly other family members to take care of. He had means. Why did Jesus send him to fish? And did you know that this is the only time we have the example of someone fishing with a hook in the New Testament? And Peter catches a fish that had a shekel in its mouth. Well, the shekel was worth four drachma, which was enough to pay the tax for two people, for Jesus and Peter. Now, one small note before we continue. There is a certain species of tilapia found in the Sea of Galilee. There's several, but there's one particular one. This fish has been nicknamed St. Peter's fish because it is believed that this may have been the fish Peter caught. And what's so cool about these fish is that they hold their eggs in their mouths until they are hatched. And even afterwards, the babies can swim back into their mouth when danger comes. And it is also believed that they prepare themselves for holding the eggs in their mouths by collecting things like rocks. And some have actually been found with bottle caps in their mouths. Now others believe the fish Peter caught might have been the barbel, which was a fish that eats snails and scavenges for food in the mud. And since tilapia was caught with nets and barbel was caught on hooks, you can see why some would say this. Okay. While that's interesting, let's get back to it. Remember, I think there's more going on here. So Jesus pays the tax for Peter and himself. Remember, this tax was originally a way to take care of the tabernacle and then the temple. It had a long history among the Jews, and it helped to support the most important place for them. Nothing wrong with that. Seems legit. However, notice the example that Jesus gives in comparison. He talks about collecting money from customs and tribute that make those in power wealthy. Who's collecting this tax? Who has their hands in this money? The religious leaders, money changers, temple aristocracy. The same people Jesus has butted heads with. The same people he has warned his disciples about. The same people he is telling them will put him to death. These are the people in power, real power, who control things, and everybody knows it. Remember what I mentioned earlier about the money changers? They made a killing in the process of this tax collection. And the temple treasury was found to be very wealthy before the temple was destroyed by the Romans. It seems this temple tax, which had meaningful beginnings, had become just another way to make the powerful more powerful. And I think Jesus' response to Peter highlighted the corrupt system and its leadership. Think about this. By Peter getting the coin to pay the tax from the mouth of a fish, it didn't cost him anything. And I think it was symbolic of the fact that they, Jesus and his disciples, and even fellow Jews, were not held in obligation or subordinate to the temple authorities. And so Jesus highlights the corruption and their freedom. The freedom they all had as children of God. Remember Jesus' prayer? Our Father in heaven. However, Jesus pays the tax. Why? Because he always did the next right thing. Sure, they were not obligated, but the tax meant something to people. And by paying it, he avoids unnecessary negative attention. And what we have already seen and will continue to see is that Jesus is beginning to move around in more secrecy than before. He's not trying to draw more attention to himself. And remember the word for being trapped? He's not trying to hinder people, keep people, stop people from listening to him, maybe even following him. But I think it was also a lesson in humility. He did not have to pay, but he did it anyway for a greater cause. And I wonder what was going through Peter's mind as he went to the shore and cast that hook and waited for that fish. Then the anticipation as he brought it out of the water and found the coin in the fish's mouth. Maybe contemplating what Jesus told him, what it meant. Then turning around and doing it anyway, even though he didn't have to. The reality that there was something more important in that moment than, I don't have to do this, but it's the right thing. And this lesson in humility will be important because the next section, we actually have the disciples arguing about who would be the greatest in the kingdom. But that's next time on the Life of Jesus. For now, grace and peace, and I'll talk to you soon.